I find abstract thinking to be the researcher's superpower, because basically without abstract thinking there's no research. It's one skill that is important for virtually everything we do. So let's start with what is abstract thinking. And we can start by looking at what is an abstraction. And an abstraction is a general concept of idea rather than something concrete or tangible. So basically it comprises two complementary aspects. The first one is that when we do abstract thinking, we clear away details to build simplifications of the world. And obviously, when we clear away details and build these simplifications, we lose the detail, but we understand the general principles that illuminate the essentials. So it's basically a stepping back from the actual thing happening and understanding the mechanisms, the principles behind what is happening. We can look at abstract thinking from a construals perspective. So there's a construals theory which kind of tries to capture abstract thinking. And construals theory is actually a psychological theory where we can see things at different levels of distance. When we employ high-level construals, we are employing abstract, superordinate, and decontextualized mental representations, which then enables us to activate abstract thinking, which are verbal, analytical, evaluative approach to thinking about the causes, meanings, and consequences of symptoms and feelings. This is the formal definition, as opposed to lower-level construals, which are concrete mental representations, including subordinate, contextual, and incidental details. And low-level construals enables us to use concrete thinking, which are factual, perceptual aspects of a situation or experience, directing attention to the experience of events and feelings. So we have these two opposites, abstract thinking and concrete thinking, and as researchers we have to grasp both. And the reason why we have to grasp both, it's because wise reasoning, there's a concept by Grossman which suggests the concept of wise reasoning. It's not about just being good at abstract thinking or concrete thinking. It's actually about balancing both. It's about mastering both and, in a sense, revert between the two and link the two. So as the theory suggests, wise reasoning is about abstract and concrete thinking and being able to master both. And this is important because even though this presentation is about abstract thinking and highlighting all things abstract thinking, it's not diminishing concrete thinking. The reason the focus is on abstract thinking is that in most cases, we are naturally better at concrete thinking, at looking at what is happening. Even in research, we start with concrete thinking, with the pieces of information that we work with to build something more abstract, to derive generalizations. So the emphasis is on abstract thinking, but it's not to diminish concrete thinking. Both are important. And as researchers, we need to learn about both and how to shift between the two types of thinking. The next area that is important to address is why abstract thinking. What is the role of abstract thinking in life and, more importantly, in the context of research? So abstract reasoning or abstract thinking involves transcending immediate sensory input and specific instances, so the concrete element, to identify underlying patterns, relationships, and fundamental principles. And these three things, if we look at what we do when we do research, marketing research, or any research, at least social science research, is about trying to identify these. If you're doing a PhD you know the ultimate goal is to make a contribution to knowledge, and therefore you will have to come up with some patterns, relationships, or principles at the end of your thesis that are backed up by your data. If we are writing a paper, it's the same thing. So these patterns, relationships, and principles are the essence of what researchers seek to do. And this links to theorization, because theory, in the end, are these patterns, relationships, and principles. And we can see these in the definition of theory. So theory can be defined as a framework of concepts linked through propositions and presented in the form of categories and relationships, which offer creative and rigorous structuring of ideas aimed at projecting a tentative, purposeful, and systematic view of real-world phenomena. So we can see this link between abstract thinking and theory. The two go hand in hand. There's no theory without abstract thinking, and abstract thinking naturally leads to what we call theory or theorization. If we look at what abstract thinking is about, and we look at the key characteristics of abstract thinking, we see things like psychologically distance from the specifics of the study, improved cognitive flexibility when identifying and exploiting opportunities, in this instance theorization opportunities, making causal inferences, thinking about potential causes of an outcome, evoke schematic processing and putting information in a larger perspective, improve decision outcomes under information overload. Anyone who's doing research, one of the challenges is to deal with information overload, with a lot of data in a questionnaire, in interviews, a lot of papers that we have to make sense of for our literature review. So abstract thinking helps to make better decisions when we have a lot of information, develop more and better mental representations, uncover dispositional properties, which are basically the relatively unchanging structures that characterize our underlying phenomena, and also be more creative. And we look at these 8 characteristics of abstract thinking, and we naturally conclude that all these characteristics are essential to effective theorization. So this reinforces the point that for us as researchers to theorize, there's no other way of doing it other than using high-level abstract thinking skills. So theory is abstract by nature. And the characteristic of a theory is that it is applicable across contexts or situations. So we have a theory, the theory that I used in my PhD is the adoption of innovations theory by Rogers. And at the time, this was 20 years ago, there were already 8,000 papers using that theory. And so today would be, given how research, the amount of research has grown, it will be many times more that. And that theory, those theoretical principles were applied or have been applied. I applied them to purchasing over the internet, but I remember looking at papers about planting tomatoes or adopting technologies to produce better tomatoes, agricultural machinery, all sorts of technology. And that theory can only be applied in this very diverse set of contexts because it is generic enough. It is abstract enough for those principles to be applicable across this wide variety of contexts. Now, we can look at the relevance of abstract thinking also by looking at what PhDs are about, and in particular what viva, the PhD defense, is about. There are lots of references about what is asked and what is covered in a viva and what contributes to being awarded the PhD. I particularly like this one. It provides a matrix with two axes, innovation and development in the research and scholarship and interpretation. And then it mapped out the sorts of topics in each quadrant that examiners tend to cover in a viva. So you've got, I'm not going to read them, but you've got there those for quadrant A, for quadrant B, for quadrant C, but more importantly for quadrant D, which is high innovation and development in the research and high scholarship and interpretation, where really the PhD-ness comes from. So the research found that success, and in this instance, the amount of changes candidates were asked came from their performance in quadrant D. And we have here elements like contribution to knowledge, which require abstract thinking skills, conceptualizing findings. Conceptualization is by nature abstract, developing conceptual frameworks. Again, you can't develop a conceptual framework without abstract thinking. Synthesizing involves abstract thinking, and establishing links and concepts. So all these areas of performance that are directly involved in the award of the PhD require abstract thinking. So if you are on your way of becoming an established researcher by doing your PhD, abstract thinking is probably the most important skill you can develop over the course of your work, because that's where the PhD-ness will come from. We can also look at what journals expect. So if you are a PhD student submitting papers, or more importantly, an established academic submitting your papers and wanting to get your papers accepted in the best journals, this is what journals expect. Strong theoretical contribution, coherent, logical, and integrated manuscript, writes clearly at a conceptual level, synthesizes literature effectively, aligns theory, method, and findings, generalizes beyond context. All these require abstract thinking. If we can summarize the main reason why papers are not accepted, you can have issues like, the study is poorly designed or not enough cases. You can look at that. But I've seen papers with data that was not necessarily the strongest, but the theorizing that came out of them is good enough to make a good contribution to knowledge. And they were accepted. I've had papers like that where maybe the data set was not the strongest, but because the study was well designed and allowed the extraction of this abstract meaning that then leads to a theoretical contribution, the paper was accepted. So from a why abstract thinking perspective, we have here, I hope I've demonstrated to you, that we have unequivocal evidence that abstract thinking is perhaps the most important skill. It's the researcher's superpower.